The coughing hit so hard I had to brace both hands against the steering wheel before I blacked out. My rental sedan idled outside the wrought iron gates of Sinclair Vineyard Estate, while the evening air buzzed with cicadas loud enough to drown out the engine. I tasted blood, grabbed a tissue from the center console, and watched a tiny red stain spread across the white paper. The yellow light on my military wrist monitor blinked once every 3 seconds, blood oxygen declining. I already knew that. The monitor wasn't telling me anything my lungs hadn't been screaming for the last 2 hours. 3 days earlier, I'd flown my final evacuation mission over flooded marshland during a humanitarian deployment. One rescued civilian had collapsed in the helicopter before we reached the field hospital. Less than 48 hours later, Army infectious disease specialists isolated me after I developed symptoms. The diagnosis came fast: melioidosis. Rare, dangerous, treatable, if treatment started quickly. The Army physicians wanted me under controlled observation while additional test results came back. I insisted on spending one night at home before reporting to Fort Stewart's medical isolation unit the following morning. Looking back, that decision almost killed me. I punched in the gate code I'd memorized before I was old enough to drive. The gates rolled open. The estate looked exactly the same: perfect rows of grapevines, stone fountains, fresh landscaping. Everything trimmed within an inch of its life. My father loved things that could be controlled, people included. I grabbed my duffel bag from the passenger seat. Inside, it sat my military-issued medical kit. The specialized therapeutic antibodies weren't something you found at the neighborhood pharmacy. They had been packed specifically for my condition if my symptoms accelerated before I reached military care. I checked the zipper twice. Still there. Good. I just needed to get through one uncomfortable evening. As I stepped inside the main house, nobody looked happy to see me. The foyer had been transformed into what looked more like a luxury hotel than a family home. Florists carried enormous white arrangements across polished marble floors. Caterers wheeled stainless steel warming carts toward the ballroom. Someone argued over imported champagne that cost more than my first used truck. My mother stood in the middle of it, all holding a clipboard. "No, the crystal goes on the east terrace," Meredith said without looking at me. "And tell the pastry chef I ordered 12 raspberry towers, not 10. One of the caterers hurried away. Only then did she glance in my direction. Oh, that was it. Just oh. Her eyes moved from my boots to my uniform jacket, then settled on my face. "You look exhausted." "I don't feel great." She frowned. "You look pale. Did you sleep on the flight home?" "I've been exposed to. You should put on some makeup before guests start arriving tomorrow. You look like you've been living under a bridge." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because after months of flying rescue missions, sleeping in helicopters, eating cold military rations, and pulling strangers out of flooded villages, the biggest concern inside this house was apparently my foundation shade. "I actually need to." "Cadence," she interrupted again. "Try not to wander around the house looking miserable. Gemma has reporters coming for the vineyard launch. Pictures last forever." That sentence told me everything. I hadn't even been home 5 minutes. My health ranked below social media photographs. I carried my bag farther inside. Music drifted from hidden speakers while decorators adjusted velvet runners on the staircase. 2 men unloaded handcrafted wine barrels stamped with the Sinclair family crest. Everything smelled like polished wood, expensive flowers, and money. Then, another coughing fit doubled me over. This one lasted longer. When it finally stopped, I noticed 2 waiters staring. They quickly looked away. I checked my wrist monitor again. Still yellow, still dropping, not critical, yet. I pulled at my phone and opened the secure Army medical app. One missed message from Captain Roland Briggs. "Lieutenant Sinclair, report any respiratory deterioration immediately. Do not isolate yourself from medical supervision." I started typing a reply. My fingers hesitated. If I admitted my symptoms had worsened, he'd probably send someone immediately. I looked around the house again. Tomorrow afternoon, over 100 wealthy investors, politicians, and country club members would fill this property celebrating Gemma's luxury vineyard brand. My parents would never forgive me if military vehicles rolled onto the estate before the event. Funny. Even then, I was still trying to protect them. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. That decision would haunt every hour that followed. There's one object inside this estate that seems ordinary the first time you see it. A heavy family signet ring my father never takes off. At that moment, I had no idea that Ring would unlock the truth behind everything that happened to me, and by the time its real purpose was exposed, 3 military helicopters would be circling over this property. Cadence, Gemma's voice echoed from the curved staircase. She walked down wearing a silk-fitting robe while 2 stylists followed behind carrying garment bags. There you are. She hugged the air somewhere near my shoulder without actually touching me. I heard you got back, about 30 seconds ago. She smiled. You still have that military sense of humor. I don't think that's what people call it. Laughed anyway. You made it just in time. Tomorrow is going to be huge. Magnolia Crest Wines finally launches nationwide. I thought your company was called Maison Gem. It was. What happened? She looked away for a split second. Rebranding. Interesting. Gemma never rebranded successful businesses. She abandoned failing ones. Before I could ask another question, another wave of dizziness swept over me. I reached for the nearest piece of furniture. A massive mahogany sideboard caught my weight. The room tilted. My breathing sounded loud enough for everyone to hear. Someone finally noticed, not with concern, with annoyance. Heavy footsteps crossed the marble floor behind me. I knew it. My father's voice, cold, controlled, disappointed before he even finished the sentence. Arthur Sinclair stopped directly in front of me. He looked at my hand gripping the furniture, then at the guests moving around the foyer. What exactly are you doing? I'm sick. You certainly look determined to advertise it. I need medical. He raised one hand. No. His voice stayed calm enough to freeze the room. I will not have you stumbling around this house playing the weak, attention-seeking soldier while we're preparing the most important event this family has hosted in years. I stared at him, trying to catch enough air to answer. You'll stay in the guest house until you can manage to look presentable, he continued. Whatever this performance is, you're not ruining the atmosphere inside my home. Then he stepped aside, pointed toward the detached guest cottage, and spoke as though he were directing an employee instead of his daughter. Go, before someone mistakes you for an emergency. I forced myself to keep walking, because stopping made it harder to start breathing again. The guest cottage sat about 80 yards behind the main house, tucked between a line of oak trees and a small reflecting pond that my mother liked to show off during charity tours. My father called it privacy. I had a different word for it. Out of sight. The moment I stepped inside, I locked the door behind me. The cottage was spotless, almost too perfect, with fresh flowers on the dining table and folded towels in the bathroom that looked like nobody had ever touched them. It felt less like a place for family and more like a hotel room reserved for people who weren't supposed to stay long. I dropped my duffel bag onto the bed. Another cough bent me over. This one stole my balance. By the time I caught myself against the mattress, my chest felt like someone had poured hot sand into both lungs. Every breath scraped. Come on, I muttered. I unzipped the bag, uniform, extra boots, flight gloves, civilian clothes, notebook, toiletries. I dug deeper, nothing. I emptied the entire bag onto the bed, nothing. The medical kit was gone. I froze. No, that wasn't possible. I packed it myself before leaving Hunter Army Airfield. Dark green military case, red biohazard stripe, electronics seal. Without it, I had no therapeutic antibodies if my symptoms accelerated before military medical transport reached me. I searched the room, even though I knew better. Closet, bathroom, kitchen cabinets, under the bed, nothing my phone. I reached into my jacket pocket. Empty. The other pocket. Empty. Back pocket. Nothing. A slow realization settled over me. Nobody had stolen random items. Someone had taken exactly the 2 things that connected me to the army. My breathing became even shorter. I closed my eyes. Think, don't panic. Panic wastes oxygen. Captain Briggs drilled that lesson into every flight crew after medical emergency training. Control your breathing before your breathing controls you. I inhaled slowly, held it, released it. Barely helped. There was only one person in this family who believed every problem could be solved by locking it in a room. My father. I grabbed the bedpost, pulled myself upright, and headed back toward the main house. The walk that normally took 2 minutes felt like 20. By the time I reached the rear entrance, sweat had soaked through my undershirt. Inside, preparations for tomorrow's launch party had somehow become even louder. Someone tested a string quartet. Event planners argued over seating charts. A florist complained that the imported orchids had arrived with the wrong ribbon color. Nobody noticed me, or maybe they did. Looking away required less effort than helping. I knew exactly where my father would be. Whenever he wanted silence, he disappeared into his private study. The room hadn't changed since I was 16. Dark walnut shelves, leather chairs, historic maps of Georgia vineyards, a locked display cabinet containing antique rifles he'd never fired. I knocked once. No answer. I opened the door anyway. Arthur sat behind his enormous desk, reviewing financial reports. Without looking up, he slowly turned the heavy gold signet ring on his finger. I'd watched him make that motion my entire life. Whenever he was calculating something, whenever someone disappointed him, whenever he was about to make a decision that benefited himself, he finally looked up. I thought I told you to stay in the cottage. My medical kit is gone. So is my phone. His expression didn't change. I know. The answer came so quickly, it almost stunned me. You took them? I had them removed. Why? Because I don't allow unidentified military pharmaceuticals or hazardous equipment inside my home. My treatment isn't unidentified. It is to me. It's prescribed by Army physicians. You are not on an Army base. I stared at him. My oxygen levels are dropping. I've heard dramatic speeches before. This isn't drama. I disagree. I stepped closer. I need that kit. Arthur leaned back comfortably. The men who carried your luggage informed me there was a sealed military medical container inside. You searched my property? I inspected what entered my estate. My gears isn't your property. My estate is. The room went quiet. Outside the study window, I could hear workers unloading another truck. Life continued. Inside this room, mine was becoming negotiable. Where is it? I asked. He rotated the signet ring once more. The basement vault. I blinked. The vault? The same one that stores our business records, rare wine inventory, and family valuables. You locked life-saving medication in a vault? I secured potentially dangerous materials. It's military issued. Exactly. His voice stayed calm. I've spent 40 years building this family's reputation. I will not risk someone discovering biological agents or battlefield drugs inside my residence because my youngest daughter refuses to separate military life from civilian life. I almost laughed. Battlefield drugs? They're not battlefield drugs. They're targeted antibodies. They arrived in a military container marked with federal warnings because that's standard protocol. For soldiers. I am a soldier. He smiled without warmth. Not here. A violent coughing fit interrupted me. I grabbed the edge of his desk before my knees gave out. Dark spots floated across my vision. Arthur watched without moving. No concern. No urgency. Just observation. When I finally caught enough air to speak again, my voice sounded rough. I need my phone. No. I have to report symptom progression. You'll report it tomorrow. I may not have tomorrow. I find that highly unlikely. You don't understand what melioidosis can do. I understand fear. This isn't fear. I think it is. His certainty irritated me more than the fever. He had already decided what reality looked like. Facts no longer mattered, only control. I flew 6 civilians out of flooded villages last week, I said quietly. I watched people die because treatment arrived too late. I'm telling you exactly what needs to happen. He folded his hands. I'm telling you exactly what will happen. He stood, walked around the desk, stopped less than 2 feet away. Even at 31 years old, he still had that ability to make every conversation feel like I was 14 again. You've mistaken your military rank for personal authority. His voice remained almost gentle. Out there, perhaps people salute you. They do because of the position, not because of me. Either way, you've grown accustomed to obedience. I looked him straight in the eye. I've grown accustomed to responsibility. He ignored the answer. Without another word, he walked to the study door. I assumed he was finally going to let me retrieve my medical kit. Instead, I heard the deadbolt click. He had locked the door from the inside. I turned slowly. Arthur slipped the key into his pocket. Then he looked at me with the same expression he'd worn when I was a teenager who dared question one of his rules. Listen carefully, Cadence. I leaned harder against the desk, struggling to pull enough air into my lungs. Under this roof, he said, your rank means absolutely nothing. Another breath, another cough, another wave of dizziness, you will stop giving orders. He took one slow step closer. And before you leave this house, you're finally going to learn what every member of this family should have learned years ago. He paused just long enough to make sure I was still listening. You obey my authority. Not the United States Army's. I stayed on my feet only long enough to unlock the guest cottage before my legs finally gave out. The door slammed behind me. I barely made it to the bed. Every breath felt shorter than the one before it. My chest tightened until even shallow breathing took effort. I kicked off my boots without bending over because I knew I wouldn't have enough air to stand back up if I did. My wrist monitor flashed the same yellow warning. Blood oxygen continuing to decline. I reached for my pulse too fast. The army doctors had warned me this could happen if the infection spread into my bloodstream. Fever, respiratory distress, exhaustion. They had also warned me not to delay treatment. I looked at the empty space beside my bed where my medical kit should have been. My own father had turned medical treatment into a locked possession. I checked the bathroom mirror. The woman staring back at me barely resembled the officer who had landed helicopters under enemy fire 6 days earlier. My cheeks had lost their color, sweat soaked my hairline. My lips already carried the faint bluish tint I had seen too many times on patients struggling for oxygen. I splashed cold water across my face. It helped for maybe 5 seconds. The thermometer inside the bathroom cabinet belonged to my mother's emergency guest supplies. I scanned my forehead. 104.1 degrees. Fantastic, I muttered. I leave one humanitarian mission just to end up trapped in my childhood bedroom. Even sick, sarcasm was cheaper than therapy. I sat back on the edge of the bed and forced myself through controlled breathing. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds hold, 4 seconds out. Again. Not because it fixed anything. Because panic burned oxygen faster than fever. Outside, I heard laughter floating across the vineyard. The launch party rehearsal had apparently turned into an early celebration. Someone uncorked another bottle. A group applauded. Music drifted through the trees. Inside the cottage, I counted breaths. The contrast almost felt funny. Almost. A soft knock landed on the door. Before I answered, it opened. Gemma stepped inside, carrying a slim tan leather folder tucked under one arm. She wore designer jeans, a white cashmere sweater, and makeup that probably cost more than my monthly truck payment. She looked like someone heading to a magazine interview. I looked like someone who needed an ICU bed. She closed the door behind her. I heard you're having a rough day. I'll survive. She smiled. Let's not promise things we can't guarantee. She walked to the bed without asking permission. Then she noticed the thermometer. 104? She whistled. Ouch. I waited. Gemma never visited anyone unless she wanted something. She sat beside me and carefully placed the leather folder onto the blanket. I actually came to help. I seriously doubt that. You always assume the worst about me. You've earned that reputation. She ignored the comment. Instead, she opened the folder and slid several legal documents toward me. At first, I couldn't focus. My vision kept drifting. The letters blurred together until I blinked several times. Finally, the title became clear. Irrevocable relinquishment of beneficial interest. I frowned. What is this? Our grandfather's land trust. My eyes moved farther down the page. Legal parcel numbers, property descriptions, trust account references. Then my own name. Cadence Elise Sinclair, beneficiary. The trust contained nearly 600 acres of undeveloped land bordering the eastern side of the vineyard. Grandpa Silas had divided ownership equally between his grandchildren years before he died. I looked back at Gemma. This transfers my share to you. Correct. For $1, it's symbolic. No. I looked directly at her. It's insulting, she sighed dramatically. I was hoping you'd be more cooperative. Why? Because my company needs liquidity. I almost laughed despite the fever. Mason gem? She quickly corrected me. Magnolia crest, so the rebrand didn't fix anything. Her smile disappeared. For the first time that evening, I saw something genuine behind her polished appearance. Worry. Not about me, about money. She folded her arms. My investors expect results. I thought tomorrow's launch solved that. It solves everything if tomorrow succeeds. And if it doesn't? She looked away. It has to. That's not an answer. Silence answered for her. The articles I'd seen online suddenly made sense. Delayed shipments, store closures, rumors about unpaid vendors. She wasn't expanding. She was drowning. How much? I asked. She hesitated. Enough. How much? Another pause. Just over 4.3 million. I let out a slow breath. That's not debt. That's temporary cash flow pressure. No. I shook my head. That's bankruptcy wearing expensive perfume. She didn't appreciate that. You have no idea how business works. I know numbers. I built a luxury brand. You built invoices you couldn't pay. Her jaw tightened. Then, almost instantly, the polished influencer smile returned. You know what's funny? What? You've spent your whole adult life risking your life for government paychecks. I said nothing. She leaned closer. You're basically a glorified government patient now. The words landed harder than I expected. Not because they hurt, because she honestly believed them. To her, military service wasn't sacrifice. It was failure. My inheritance isn't paying your debts. It isn't yours if you don't survive to enjoy it. The room became very quiet. I slowly looked up. What did you just say? Gemma lowered her voice. Dad told me about your little medical kit. I felt every muscle tighten. You know where it is? I do. Then tell me. She casually adjusted one of the papers. The basement vault. I already know that. I also know the vault stays locked. I stared at her. Until? She smiled again. Until this paperwork is signed. For several seconds, I honestly wondered if the fever was making me hallucinate. Nobody could actually say something like that. Not family. Not even strangers. You can't be serious. I'm extremely serious. My treatment? In exchange for your trust. You'd gamble with my health over real estate? I'm protecting my future. My lungs are failing, so stop wasting time arguing. She reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a silver fountain pen, clicked off the cap, then placed it gently into my shaking hand. So sign. I looked down at the pen. My fingers trembled so badly I almost dropped it. Another violent coughing fit ripped through my chest. This one didn't stop. I bent forward. My throat tightened until barely any air passed through. Dark spots spread across my vision. The edges of the room faded. Gemma simply watched, patiently, waiting, not for me to breathe, for me to surrender. As I struggled to pull oxygen into burning lungs, one awful truth became impossible to ignore. This wasn't an argument about inheritance anymore. My own family had turned my physical survival into leverage for corporate extortion. I let the pen slip from my fingers. It rolled across the hardwood floor and disappeared beneath the dresser. Gemma stared at it for a second before looking back at me. Really? I couldn't answer right away. Every breath demanded my full attention. My chest rose in short, uneven movements while another wave of dizziness swept through me. I said. I forced the words out between breaths. I'm not signing. Her smile vanished. Cadence, don't make this harder than it has to be. It's already harder than it should be. You don't have leverage here. I looked directly at her. No. My voice came out rough but steady. You don't. She folded the paperwork, slower this time. You've always had this annoying habit of believing principles matter more than outcomes. I learned that in the army. I learned something different. She stood. People with assets make the rules. She tucked the folder under her arm. I'll give you another chance after you've had more time to think. I won't. We'll see. She walked toward the door. Just before opening it, she glanced back over her shoulder. You know, Dad almost called a civilian doctor. I frowned. Almost? I told him not to waste the money. She opened the door. If you decide your inheritance isn't worth dying over, knock on the window. I'll hear you. The door clicked shut behind her. A second later, I heard the deadbolt engage from the outside. They had locked me in. Again. For a few seconds, I simply sat there listening. Footsteps faded away. Laughter drifted across the vineyard. Somewhere outside, work continued preparing tomorrow's celebration. Inside the cottage, the silence felt enormous. Another cough bent me forward. This one left bright red spots on the sleeve of my uniform. I stared at them. Not good, definitely not good. My wrist monitor vibrated. The yellow warning light blinked faster than before. Oxygen saturation dropping. Heart rate elevated. Recommended immediate medical evaluation. I was trying, I whispered. I closed my eyes and forced myself to think like an army officer instead of a frightened daughter. Emotion could wait. Procedure came first. The first lesson every medevac crew learned during mass casualty training was painfully simple. When everything feels out of control, control the next 60 seconds. Nothing more. Just the next minute. I planted both feet on the floor, box breathing. 4 seconds in, hold. 4 seconds out, hold again. The first cycle barely worked. The second slowed my pulse slightly. By the fourth cycle, the shaking in my hands had eased enough for me to think clearly. Not healthy. Just functional. Functional was enough. I mentally reviewed my options. Personal phone, gone. Military phone, gone. Medical kit, locked inside the basement vault. Car keys, probably still in my jacket. But I doubted I could drive 25 miles to Fort Stewart without passing out. Windows, locked. The cottage door, locked from outside. Almost laughed. My own family had accidentally recreated prisoner of war escape planning. Then another thought hit me. Not everything military looked military. I slowly lifted my left wrist. The tactical monitor remained secured beneath my sleeve. To anyone unfamiliar with Army medical equipment, it looked like an oversized fitness watch. Black casing, minimal display. No obvious markings except a small serial number. My father had searched my bags, he had taken my phone, but he never asked about the watch, because he didn't know what it actually was. It wasn't just a health monitor. Every Army aviation crew member assigned to certain humanitarian and biological response missions carried one. It continuously tracked encrypted biometric data, location, heart rhythm, blood oxygen, body temperature. Most of the time, it simply uploaded routine health information whenever we returned to base. But buried beneath several layers of security sat something very different. An emergency directive almost nobody ever used. I remembered Captain Roland Briggs holding one during our pre-deployment briefing. If anyone is exposed to a controlled biological threat, he'd said, this protocol is your last resort. One activation, no mistakes, no false alarms. Because once triggered, the military came. No negotiations, no delays, no exceptions. My visions blurred again, the room tilted. I slid off the bed onto my knees because standing suddenly seemed too ambitious. The hardwood floor felt cool against my palms. I crawled the remaining few feet until my back rested against the wall. Each movement stole more air. Sweat dripped onto the floorboards. The fever burned through every joint in my body. I pulled back my sleeve. The monitor recognized my fingerprint immediately. A tiny authentication icon appeared, restricted access. I pressed 2 recessed buttons simultaneously. Nothing happened. Correct, that only opened the protected menu. Another cough interrupted me. My hand slipped. For a terrifying second, I wondered whether I had enough strength left to finish. You've done harder things, I muttered. I've landed helicopters in sandstorms. You can push one more button. A small, glass-covered panel sat along the right edge of the device. Most people assumed it protected the charging port. It didn't. It covered the emergency activation switch. The instructions flashed across the screen. Emergency biosecurity activation. Confirmation required. I hesitated, not because I doubted the protocol, because I understood exactly what it meant. Once activated, this stopped being a family matter. Federal authority would immediately replace private authority. Every decision my father had made since confiscating my equipment would come under military investigation. There would be reports, evidence, witnesses, possibly criminal charges if he had obstructed emergency medical response. I thought about Arthur, then Meredith, then Gemma. 3 faces, 3 opportunities to help, 3 deliberate choices not to. My hesitation disappeared. I placed my thumb against the protected glass plate. The cover cracked inward with a sharp click. The sensor lit up. Authorization code required. Using the last steady breath I could manage, I entered the encrypted emergency sequence from memory: medical casualty, quarantine breach, BIOS security protocol active. For one long second, nothing happened. Then the screen went completely black. My stomach dropped. Had the battery died? Suddenly, the display exploded into a deep crimson glow. Warning, biosecurity red directive confirmed. Encrypted satellite connection established. Fort Stewart Medical Command. Live biometric transmission active. GPS lock confirmed. Patient status critical. A soft vibration pulsed through the device every 2 seconds. Not random. A countdown. Somewhere hundreds of miles above me, a military communications satellite had already locked onto my signal. Somewhere inside Fort Stewart, my vital signs were appearing on secure monitors in real time. Someone was now watching my oxygen fall. Someone knew exactly where I was, and for the first time since I drove through the Sinclair gates, I wasn't waiting for my family anymore. The United States Army was coming. I woke up coughing so hard, I couldn't tell whether I had actually slept or simply lost consciousness for a few hours. Sunlight pushed through the edges of the curtains, turning the room into a dull gray haze. My uniform shirt clung to my skin with dried sweat. Every muscle ached. Even lifting my head off the pillow made the room sway. The wrist monitor was still glowing. The warning light hadn't returned to yellow. It stayed deep crimson. The transmission was still active. Nobody had contacted me. Nobody needed to. The entire point of the red directive was that I wasn't expected to answer questions. My body was already answering them. I checked my temperature again, 103.9 degrees. Close enough to yesterday that it hardly mattered. Outside, laughter rolled across the vineyard. I forced myself to sit up. Today was the launch party. The estate sounded alive. Luxury SUVs crunched over the long gravel driveway. Valet called out parking assignments. A string quartet tuned their instruments somewhere near the main garden. Champagne corks popped one after another. Every sound reminded me that over 100 people were only a short walk away. While I sat locked inside a guest cottage, I shuffled toward the window. Rows of white event tents stretched across the lawn. Women in expensive dresses wandered between floral displays. Men wearing tailored suits laughed with local officials and commercial developers. I spotted television cameras near the vineyard entrance. Gemma had gotten the publicity she wanted, at least for now. Another vibration came from my wrist. The monitor displayed only one line: secure transmission confirmed. No countdown, no estimated arrival. Just confirmation that someone knew where I was. I leaned my forehead against the cool glass. Please hurry. The words barely left my mouth. Another coughing fit answered instead. When it finally stopped, I noticed something bright against my sleeve again. Blood. A little more than yesterday. I wiped it away before forcing myself toward the cottage door. Still locked. I rattled the handle. Nothing. I knocked. No response. The party outside had swallowed every other sound. I turned toward the small staircase leading to the second floor. The cottage had been built into a gentle hillside, making the upstairs balcony almost level, with part of the vineyard overlooking the main reception lawn. If I could reach it, someone might see me. One guest, one waiter, one member of the catering staff. That was all I needed. Each step felt like climbing a mountain carrying another person on my back. Halfway up, I stopped to catch my breath, then kept going. At the top sat a pair of tall glass doors covered by heavy velvet curtains. I pulled one curtain aside. Sunlight flooded into the room. Beyond the balcony stood nearly 150 guests scattered across the estate. Crystal glasses sparkled in the afternoon light. Servers moved between tables carrying silver trays. A jazz trio had replaced the morning quartet. Everything looked polished. Perfect. I unlocked the balcony handle. It barely moved. Locked, not surprising. I searched the frame until I found the secondary latch. Someone had missed that one. I released it. The handle turned. Fresh air rushed inside. For the first time in almost a day, I felt something besides stale air and fever. I stepped onto the balcony. The sudden brightness made my eyes water. Nobody looked up. Everyone below focused on conversations, wine tastings, and cameras. I gripped the railing. Help! Nothing. My voice disappeared beneath the music. I tried again. Larry, one of the groundskeepers, had worked for my grandfather for over 20 years. He usually handled vineyard maintenance during major events. I spotted him unloading supplies near the reception tent. Larry, he paused, turned slightly. Hope flickered through me. Then a photographer stepped between us. Larry kept walking. I took another breath. Or tried to. The air wouldn't come. My lungs refused to cooperate. I leaned farther over the railing. Someone, anyone. A waiter finally glanced upward. Our eyes almost met. Before either of us could react, a hand clamped around my upper arm. Hard. What do you think you're doing? My father's voice came from directly behind me. He jerked me backward with enough force that I stumbled into the room. Pain shot through my shoulder. You need to stop embarrassing this family. I need medical. You need self-control. He looked me up and down. His expressions held the same irritation someone might show after finding mud tracked across an expensive carpet. You look ridiculous. I can't breathe. You look dramatic. I pointed weakly toward the lawn. There are people. There are important people. Exactly. They're here for business. They can call an ambulance. They're here to invest. I stared at him. Even after everything that had happened, he still measured human beings by their financial value. They deserve to know. They deserve an enjoyable afternoon. I coughed into my sleeve. He noticed. His eyes narrowed. Good Lord. For one tiny moment, one tiny second, I thought I saw concern. Instead, he pulled a folded handkerchief from his pocket and tossed it onto the floor. Clean yourself up. I looked at the white cloth, didn't move. Arthur sighed heavily. You always force everything to become a spectacle. My oxygen is falling. So is your judgment. My condition is contagious if mishandled. I was already spoken in with a physician. I looked up sharply. What physician, doctor? Howard Bell. The name meant nothing to me. Our family doctor. He isn't trained for this. He assured me you're most likely suffering from exhaustion and some imported respiratory infection. I have laboratory confirmation. From military doctors. Yes, I trust. Physicians who don't exaggerate. I almost laughed. It came out as another cough. You realize this could become a federal issue? His face hardened. The only federal issue on my property would be someone disrupting this event. He reached past me. With one sharp motion, he pulled the heavy velvet curtain together. The bright afternoon disappeared. The room immediately felt smaller, darker, hotter. Then he opened the balcony door just enough to step outside. I frowned. "What are you doing?" He didn't answer. Instead, he pulled the glass door shut from the outside. The lock clicked. I rushed forward as fast as my weakened legs allowed. Too late. Arthur stood on the balcony facing me through the glass. The music from below became little more than muffled echoes. His words reached me only because he spoke slowly. A sick, unstable disappointment. He paused. "Will not embarrass this family in front of the people who actually matter." Then he walked away. His polished shoes had disappeared beyond the curtains he had just sealed around me. The room fell almost completely dark. Only thin lines of sunlight escaped around the edges of the velvet fabric. I grabbed the door handle, locked. I pounded once against the glass, no answer. Outside, applause erupted as Gemma apparently took the stage to celebrate her new vintage. Inside, every breath became shorter. The fever surged through my body with frightening speed. My chest tightened until even swallowing hurt. I slid slowly down the wall beneath the balcony doors, struggling to pull enough oxygen into lungs that suddenly felt as though they were beginning to shut down. As I fought to stay conscious, another vibration pulsed against my wrist. For a brief second, I thought about how unbelievable this entire nightmare had become. It even reminded me of another family case that spiraled far beyond anything we expected. If that kind of story keeps you hooked, watch the top right corner of your screen between minutes 45 and 55 later on. Right now, though, I had a much bigger problem. Somewhere beyond those curtains, my family was raising champagne glasses. Somewhere beyond those curtains, the army was getting closer. I just had to stay alive long enough for those two worlds to collide. I lost track of how much time had passed because every minute felt exactly like the one before it. Breathe. Cough. Wait. Repeat. The room stayed dark behind the velvet curtains. My fever blurred the edges of everything until I couldn't tell whether I was hearing real voices outside or remembering them. Then the applause started. Long, loud, organized, Gemma's speech. I forced myself onto one knee and pulled back a corner of the curtain just enough to see the lawn below. The vineyard looked like something from the cover of a luxury magazine. More than 150 guests filled the garden. Developers from Atlanta, county commissioners, bank presidents, country club board members, television reporters, local celebrities. Everyone smiled as servers walked between the tables pouring Sinclair Reserve Cabernet into oversized crystal glasses. At the center of it all stood a polished wooden podium decorated with white roses and grapevines. My father stepped behind it. Even from the second floor, I recognized the confidence in his posture. Arthur Sinclair loved audiences. He adjusted the microphone while someone lowered the background music. The conversations gradually faded. "My friends," he began. His voice carried easily across the vineyard. "Thank you for joining our family today." Polite applause followed. "This vineyard has represented excellence for nearly 50 years. Another pause. "My father planted the first vines here with a simple belief." He raised one hand toward the hills. "If you protect your family's reputation, everything else follows." I closed my eyes for a second. Grandpa had never said that. His favorite sentence had been completely different. Land remembers how people treat each other. Arthur had rewritten even his own father's memories. When I looked back outside, he lifted a crystal wine glass from the podium. "Today," he continued, "that legacy passes proudly to my eldest daughter." The crowd turned toward Gemma. She stepped forward wearing an elegant cream-colored dress that photographers absolutely loved. Camera flashes exploded around her. She smiled like she'd already forgotten our conversation from the night before. Maybe she had. Maybe she'd never considered it important. Arthur placed one hand on her shoulder. I couldn't be more proud. People clapped again. One reporter shouted for another photograph. A drone camera floated overhead, capturing everything from above. My lungs tightened, not from the infection. From the strange realization that my family truly believed this performance would erase everything happening inside the guest cottage. Another vibration pulsed against my wrist. "Still transmitting, still active," I whispered toward the monitor. "Please don't be too late." Arthur raised his glass higher, to Gemma. The guests followed. More than 150 crystal glasses caught the afternoon sunlight at the same moment. "To Magnolia Crest." The response echoed back. "To Magnolia Crest." Then, something changed. At first I thought the dizziness had returned. A faint vibration passed through the balcony doors beneath my hands, barely noticeable. The crystal pitcher sitting on the table behind me trembled, once, twice. Then stopped. I frowned. Outside, a woman looked around in confusion. Another guest adjusted the wineglass in his hand. Arthur paused in the middle of his speech. The vibration returned, this time stronger. Low, deep, steady, not thunder. Not construction equipment. I knew that sound. My heart skipped. No, it couldn't be. The vibration rolled through the windows again. Several crystal glasses on the reception tables began rattling against polished wood, soft at first, then loud enough for nearby guests to notice. Conversations stopped. Someone glanced toward the hills. The musicians lowered their instruments. A violinist looked at the conductor. "What is that?" Even through the glass, I heard someone ask the question. Arthur tried to continue. As I was saying, the rest of his sentence disappeared beneath a growing mechanical rumble. The tablecloths lifted, napkins fluttered, wine programs slid across the tables. Another gust hit. This one powerful enough to knock floral centerpieces sideways. Women grabbed their hats. Servers chased rolling silverware. Photographers looked toward the tree line instead of the podium. Arthur finally lowered his glass. What in the world? The sound became unmistakable. Rotor blades. Heavy ones. Military. I had heard Black Hawks from inside cockpits, from landing zones, from disaster sites, and from evacuation corridors. Nothing else sounded like them. Nothing. My pulse quickened. Not from fear. Recognition. The tops of the vineyard trees suddenly bent beneath a wall of moving air. Leaves exploded into the sky. Dust raced across the access road. Guests shielded their eyes. Someone pointed upward. There, 3 dark shapes rose above the trees almost simultaneously. Slate gray, fast, perfect spacing. Sikorsky UH-60 Black Hawk helicopters. Exactly 3. My throat tightened. Not from the infection this time. They came. The lead aircraft crossed directly over the eastern vineyard before banking left. The second followed several hundred feet behind. The third completed the formation. They weren't wandering. They weren't searching randomly. They flew with precise military discipline. Arthur stood frozen beside the podium. His expensive speech no longer mattered. Nobody looked at him anymore. Every face turned toward the sky. The helicopters circled once over the estate, low enough that the rotor wash tore decorative banners loose from their poles. Silk tablecloths snapped violently through the air. Champagne bottles toppled onto the grass. Rows of expensive floral arrangements collapsed. A giant promotional backdrop featuring Gemma's smiling face folded in half before crashing into the reception area. Guests screamed. Some ran. Others stood motionless, recording everything with their phones. Reporters abandoned the podium and pointed cameras upward. Children covered their ears. Valet dove behind parked cars. The noise swallowed every human voice. Arthur shouted something. Nobody heard him. The lead helicopter slowed. Then another. Then the third. Instead of leaving, they spread into a tight tactical orbit over the Sinclair estate. I watched the formation with the same attention I'd used during countless aviation briefings. Professional, controlled, purposeful. Not a public demonstration, not a training exercise. An operation. Suddenly, brilliant white beams cut through the swirling dust. Searchlights, one after another. 3 high-intensity military searchlights swept across the vineyard. Guests scattered in every direction trying to escape the blinding light. The beams ignored the reception tents, ignored the parking area, ignored the stage. All 3 converged on one place. The front lawn of the Sinclair estate. Exactly where federal responders would establish a landing zone. For the first time all weekend, I saw something I never thought I'd witness. Arthur Sinclair looked genuinely afraid, and as the helicopters continued circling overhead, I rested my forehead against the cool glass, knowing the Red Directive had reached its final stage. The United States Army hadn't come to attend a wine launch. It had come for me. I didn't realize I was smiling until another coughing fit interrupted it. The helicopters tightened their circle one final time. Then all 3 broke formation together. Anyone without military experience would have seen chaos. I saw choreography. The lead Black Hawk dipped first. The second and third matched its descent within seconds. 3 aircraft, 3 separate landing paths. One coordinated operation. The rotor wash hit the vineyard like a hurricane. Rows of perfectly trimmed grapevines bent flat beneath the force. Fresh soil exploded into the air. Wooden vineyard signs snapped loose and tumbled across the grass. Hundreds of white folding chairs tipped over one after another. The expensive floral arches Gemma had spent weeks approving collapsed before anyone could save them. Crystal glasses shattered across stone walkways. One enormous reception tent twisted sideways, its support poles buckling under the pressure. Guests screamed as napkins, menus, and flower petals flew through the air. Some women kicked off their high heels and ran. Men who had spent the afternoon discussing million-dollar developments suddenly dove behind decorative stone walls to avoid flying debris. A television cameraman refused to stop recording even after his assistant grabbed his arm. "This is live," he shouted. "I know," the assistant yelled back. "That's exactly why I'm filming." Arthur stood frozen beside the podium. His tailored suit whipped violently in the rotor wash. He tried to wave his arms. He tried shouting orders. Nobody paid attention. For perhaps the first time in his life, money couldn't make people listen. The 3 helicopters settled onto the Sinclair lawn almost simultaneously. The ground shook beneath me. The entire balcony vibrated. The windows rattled so hard I thought the glass might break. Dust swallowed everything for several long seconds. Then, the side doors burst open. Military secret personnel poured out with astonishing speed, not running wildly, moving with practiced precision. The first team carried rifles at low ready while spreading outward from the aircraft. The second team unloaded sealed medical cases and portable decontamination equipment. The third established communications with red hand signals that needed no shouting over the engines. Then I noticed something else. Every medic wore full-body biohazard protective suits, white containment gear, filtered respirators, sealed gloves, clear face shields. Nobody had come expecting a routine medical pickup. They had come prepared for biological containment. The guests noticed too. Panic spread faster than the dust cloud. "What kind of disease is this? I knew something was wrong. Stay away from them." Several people tried sprinting toward the parking area. They never made it. Armed U.S. Army personnel intercepted them before they reached the driveway. One officer raised both hands. "Stop where you are." His amplified voice cut through the helicopter noise. "Federal quarantine procedures are now in effect." Confused shouting erupted from every direction. "I have to leave. My children are in the car. You can't stop us." The officer never raised his voice. "No one enters, no one exits. Remain exactly where you are." More soldiers moved into position. Within less than a minute, they had formed a complete security perimeter around the reception area. Every entrance, every driveway, every pedestrian path, covered. Guests who had spent years believing private wealth could solve every inconvenience suddenly discovered something different. Federal authority did not negotiate with country club memberships. I leaned closer to the glass despite the dizziness. Another wave of coughing shook my body, but I refused to look away. This operation had become larger than me. Military medics rolled portable isolation stretchers toward the main house. Another team carried environmental testing equipment across the lawn. One specialist planted warning markers around the landing zone. Everything happened with calm efficiency. Nobody ran. Nobody argued. Everyone already knew exactly where they belonged. Outside the main entrance, Arthur finally found his voice. He marched directly toward the lead helicopter. Even over the engines, I could hear him shouting. "This is private property." He pointed furiously toward the aircraft. "You are trespassing on commercial land." Several guests nodded nervously behind him. Arthur jabbed a finger toward the soldiers. "I'll have every one of you arrested." Nobody responded. Not one soldier even turned his head. Their attention remained fixed on their assigned sectors. Arthur looked stunned. He wasn't accustomed to being ignored. He took another step forward. "I own this estate." Still nothing. Then someone climbed down from the lead helicopter. Captain Roland Briggs. Even before I recognized his face, I recognized the way he moved, measured, confident, never wasting a single motion. His flight helmet remained secured beneath his chin. Dust covered his boots. A sidearm rested on his belt beside his medical gear. Unlike the flight medics, he wore standard Army aviation gear rather than a containment suit, but a protective respirator hung ready across his chest. He walked straight toward Arthur, not quickly, not slowly, simply with the certainty of someone who already knew exactly how this conversation would end. Arthur stepped directly into his path. Finally, he spread both hands dramatically. "I'm Arthur Sinclair." Captain Briggs didn't answer. "I'm the owner of this property." Still nothing. "I demand an explanation." Silence. Arthur's face reddened. "My attorneys will bury whoever authorized this stunt." Captain Briggs stopped less than 6 feet away. His expression never changed. Cold, professional, unmoved. Arthur pointed toward the helicopters. You have damaged millions of dollars worth of agricultural property. Captain Briggs looked past him toward the estate, not at the vineyard, not at the reception, toward the guest cottage. Then he spoke his first words. Where is First Lieutenant Cadence Sinclair? Arthur blinked. I asked you a question. Captain Briggs repeated himself. Where is First Lieutenant Cadence Sinclair? Arthur folded his arms. My daughter isn't your concern. Captain Briggs removed a folded document from a waterproof case. Without any emotion, he held it where Arthur could see the federal authorization seal. This operation is. Arthur barely glanced at the paperwork. You have no jurisdiction here. Captain Briggs slipped the document back into its case. I am not here to debate jurisdiction. Arthur took another aggressive step. I'm ordering you off my property. Captain Briggs never acknowledged the demand. Instead, he looked directly at 2 nearby soldiers. Maintain perimeter. Yes, sir. He turned back to Arthur one final time. His voice stayed calm enough to make the words even heavier. Arthur Sinclair. For the first time, he used my father's full name. By authority of the United States Army and under an active federal biosecurity emergency response, I am demanding the immediate and unconditional surrender of First Lieutenant Cadence Sinclair. The vineyard fell strangely quiet. Even the frightened guests seemed to stop breathing for a moment. Arthur stared back in disbelief, because at that exact moment, he finally understood something that had never crossed his mind. This operation wasn't asking permission. It had come to take me home. I heard my father answer before I could see him. You're not taking one step inside my house. His voice carried through the balcony doors, sharp enough to cut through the fading rotor noise. I forced myself upright and pulled the curtain aside again. Captain Roland Briggs didn't even blink. Move. It wasn't a request. Arthur laughed once. You clearly have no idea who you're dealing with. He pointed toward the front entrance. My legal team knows every judge in this county. Captain Briggs remained perfectly still. My company employs over 400 people. No response. I've donated to half the elected officials standing at this party. Still nothing. Arthur turned toward 4 private security guards stationed near the foyer. They wore matching black suits with concealed earpieces. Men I'd seen at every Sinclair event for years. Don't just stand there. He pointed toward the soldiers. Keep them out. The guards hesitated. One of them glanced toward the helicopters. Another looked at the army personnel surrounding the estate. None of them moved. I gave you an order, Arthur barked. Finally, the head of security stepped forward. Sir, his voice lacked confidence. I didn't hire you to think. Arthur cut him off. I hired you to protect my property. The guard swallowed. Then, reluctantly, the 4 men formed a line across front entrance, not aggressively. Almost apologetically, Captain Briggs watched them for a moment. Then he reached into the waterproof case attached to his vest. He removed a sealed document inside a clear protective sleeve. The gold federal seal reflected the afternoon sun. He held it where everyone could see it. This warrant has been authorized under the Emergency Powers Act. His voice remained calm. It grants immediate federal authority to recover an active-duty Army officer during a confirmed biosecurity emergency. Nobody spoke. Captain Briggs continued. It also authorizes entry into any structure necessary to secure medical equipment, preserve evidence, and eliminate ongoing biological risk. Arthur waved dismissively. I don't care what piece of paper you're holding. Captain Briggs folded the warrant. I wasn't asking for your opinion. Then he looked toward the soldiers. Executu. Everything happened at once. 2 military police officers calmly approached the private security guards. You are ordered to step aside. The guards exchanged nervous looks. One quietly removed his earpiece. Another slowly raised both hands. Within seconds, all 4 stepped away from the entrance. Not one of them was willing to physically interfere with federal military personnel carrying lawful authority. Arthur looked stunned. You work for me. The head of security avoided eye contact. Sir, I'm sorry. Captain Briggs never acknowledged the exchange. He motioned forward. The first response team entered the mansion. The second secured the foyer. The third headed directly toward the basement staircase. They weren't searching. They already knew exactly where they were going. The red directive had transmitted more than my vital signs. It had included my last emergency report, the one identifying where my medical equipment had been taken. I slowly made my way downstairs inside the guest cottage. Each step hurt, each breath burned. When I reached the first floor window, I had a clear view of the side entrance leading toward the basement level beneath the main house. Several medics disappeared through it carrying compact breaching equipment. Arthur finally realized their destination. The vault! He lunged forward. You are absolutely not entering my vault. Two military police officers blocked his path without touching him. Remain where you are, sir. Those are confidential business records, Captain Briggs answered without looking away from the entrance. If your records are unrelated to this investigation, they will remain confidential. And if they aren't? Captain Briggs said nothing. That silence spoke loudly enough. Inside the basement, a dull metallic impact echoed through the estate. Then another. Hydraulic breaching tools. The Sinclair family vault had been built like a bank safe. Thick reinforced steel, electronic locking system, concrete walls. It had always impressed visitors. Today it delayed trained military personnel by less than 2 minutes. A loud crack echoed upward. The locking mechanism failed. Seconds later, the heavy vault door swung open. Arthur closed his eyes, almost as if he already knew what else was inside. One medic emerged carrying something I recognized instantly. Dark green, red biohazard stripe, electronic security seal, my military medical kit. Even from across the property, I felt my shoulders relax. They found it. One medic immediately passed it to another already preparing a sterile isolation container. But the search didn't stop. Captain Briggs stepped into the vault himself. That caught my attention. He hadn't come merely to retrieve my equipment. Inside, soldiers carefully inspected every shelf surrounding the area where my kit had been stored. One forensic specialist photographed everything before touching it. Another cataloged every container. Then someone called out, "Captain." A cardboard archive box emerged from a lower shelf. Then another, then a third. Arthur's face lost every trace of color. Those aren't relevant. Nobody answered him. The first box contained thick accounting binders. One investigator flipped through several pages. His expression changed immediately. Offshore transfers. Another investigator accepted the folder, came in accounts. A third binder followed. Undeclared corporate revenue. Nearby sheriff's deputies, who had arrived to assist with perimeter security, quietly moved closer. Captain Briggs handed one ledger directly to the senior deputy. You'll want to see this. The deputy opened several pages, his eyebrows lifted. These numbers, he looked back at Arthur, don't match any Georgia corporate filings I've ever seen. Arthur finally spoke again. That's privileged financial information. The deputy calmly closed the binder. It may also be evidence. More containers came out. One held shipping invoices. Another contained customs declarations. Then one of the soldiers uncovered something entirely different. Several equipment manuals bearing Department of Defense property markings. Another investigator carried out electronic irrigation control units still displaying faded federal inventory labels. Captain Briggs examined one serial number. His voice stayed level. Cross-reference these. A communications specialist answered within seconds, confirmed. He looked up, reported stolen from Fort Stewart surplus storage 18 months ago. Several guests standing behind the military perimeter gasped. Someone whispered, "Did they just say stolen military property?" News cameras zoomed in. Reporters stopped talking and simply kept recording. Arthur looked toward the local sheriff. "This is ridiculous." The sheriff didn't answer immediately. Instead, he accepted another stack of documents from Army investigators. Page after page, transfer records, purchase agreements, foreign bank transactions, equipment inventories, everything carefully labeled, everything dated, everything connected. The sheriff slowly closed the final folder. Then he looked directly at Arthur. "I think we're well past ridiculous." The elegant image Arthur had spent decades building began collapsing faster than any reception tent damaged by helicopter rotors. His political connections couldn't argue with signed financial records. His reputation couldn't erase military inventory numbers. His wealth couldn't explain why an active-duty officer's life-saving medical equipment had been locked beside evidence of possible federal crimes. Standing alone in the middle of his ruined front lawn, Arthur finally understood what the vault had really protected all those years. It had never protected the Sinclair legacy. It had simply hidden the paper trail that could destroy it. I heard boots racing toward the guest cottage before anyone reached the door. Not hurried, not frantic, disciplined. 3 quick knocks landed against the wood. First Lieutenant Cadence Sinclair. Captain Briggs' voice. "If you can hear me, identify yourself." I tried to answer. The cough came first, then one word, "Here." A second later, the lock gave way. The door opened. 4 Army flight medics entered wearing full biohazard containment suits. One immediately approached my wrist monitor while another knelt beside me. "Cadence, I'm Major Ellis. Don't try to stand." I nodded. The medic clipped a pulse oximeter onto my finger. Another checked my pupils. Someone behind them opened my recovered military medical kit. Captain Briggs stepped inside last. For the first time all weekend, I saw an expression on his face that wasn't made of steel. "You should have called sooner, Lieutenant." "I tried." He gave a small nod. "I know." He'd already seen the biometric data. There was no need to explain. A medic looked up. "Oxygen saturation 83. Another answered immediately. "High-flow oxygen." The clear mask settled over my face. Cold oxygen rushed into my lungs. It wasn't instant relief, but it was the first full breath I'd taken since arriving at the estate. Another medic prepared a syringe from the secured medication case. "Confirm patient. First Lieutenant Cadence Sinclair." Confirmed medication. "Targeted therapeutic antibodies." Confirmed. Captain Briggs watched every step. "Administer." The needle entered my arm. I barely felt it. Relief came from knowing the medication was finally where it belonged, inside me, not locked inside a basement vault. The lead medic smiled behind her face shield. "You're going to feel awful for a while." "I already do." She laughed softly. "Good." I frowned. "That means we're making progress." Even Captain Briggs almost smiled. 2 medics transferred me onto a tactical evacuation gurney. They secured shoulder straps, checked the oxygen line again, and covered me with a thermal blanket. "Ready?" Captain Briggs looked toward the doorway. "Let's move." They rolled me outside. The afternoon sunlight felt almost unreal after so many hours trapped behind curtains. Helicopters still idled across the front lawn. Soldiers maintained the federal perimeter. Reporters continued broadcasting live. As my gurney crossed the driveway, conversations stopped one by one. More than 150 guests turned toward me. Phones rose into the air almost automatically. Everywhere I looked, people were recording. Not because I wanted attention, because nobody could believe what they were witnessing. The daughter Arthur Sinclair had dismissed as an embarrassment was being evacuated under full federal military protection. They wheeled me through the mansion's front doors. The grand foyer looked nothing like it had yesterday. Flower arrangements lay scattered across the marble floor. Broken crystal glittered beneath overturned chairs. Military evidence markers stood beside open document boxes. Forensic investigators photographed everything. Near the staircase stood the local sheriff. His deputies had finished reviewing the records recovered from the vault. Arthur remained exactly where they had instructed him to stand. His expensive suit was covered with dust from the helicopter landing. For the first time in my life, he looked old. Meredith stood nearby with tears running through carefully applied makeup. She kept repeating the same sentence. "This is all a misunderstanding." Nobody answered. Gemma looked completely different from the confident woman who had asked me to sign away my inheritance. Mascara streaked down her cheeks. Her designer dress carried dirt stains near the hem. She spotted me first. "There she is." She pointed toward my gurney. "This is because of her." Every camera immediately swung toward us. Captain Briggs never slowed our movement. The sheriff stepped directly into our path. He removed a folded document from his jacket. "Arthur Sinclair." Arthur looked up without speaking. "You are under arrest for obstruction of a federal biosecurity emergency response, suspected possession of stolen federal property, and multiple counts of tax-related financial fraud pending further federal review." One deputy stepped forward. Heavy steel handcuffs clicked around Arthur's wrists. He didn't resist. He simply stared at me, not with anger, not even with disappointment, only disbelief, as though he still couldn't understand how events had slipped beyond his control. The sheriff turned. "Meredith Sinclair." She shook her head. "No, this has to stop. I never touched anything. You are also harassed pending investigation into obstruction and conspiracy related to this case." Another pair of handcuffs closed around her wrists. She began crying openly. Not once did she ask how I was feeling. Not once. Then came Gemma. She backed away. "This isn't fair." 2 deputies approached. "I didn't steal anything." She pointed at me again. "She did this." One deputy calmly took her wrist. "Please don't resist. I built that company." She pulled away. "My whole future is gone." The second deputy secured her other arm, the handcuffs locked. She turned toward me with tears streaming down her face. "You ruined everything." The oxygen mask muffled my voice, but I answered anyway. "No." I paused to catch another steady breath. "You did." That only made her louder. "You destroyed our family." Captain Briggs finally stopped beside my gurney. He looked directly at Gemma. "Your sister activated an emergency medical protocol after being denied access to life-saving treatment." His voice remained calm. "Everything that followed resulted from choices made inside this household." Gemma opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Because there was nothing left to argue. Around us, guests lowered their phones one by one. Some looked ashamed. Others simply looked stunned. Many had spent years admiring the Sinclair family. Now they were watching that image collapse in real time. Outside, several black federal transport vans rolled through the military perimeter, rear doors already open. Deputies escorted Arthur toward the first vehicle. He walked without resistance. His shoulders had lost the rigid confidence I'd known my entire life. Meredith followed behind him. Gemma continued crying and shouting until deputies guided her toward another van. "I'll appeal this. My lawyers." Nobody interrupted her. Nobody needed to. The evidence had already spoken. I watched through clearer eyes than I'd had since arriving home. The medication had begun working. The oxygen no longer felt like it was fighting my lungs. As deputies finished loading the prisoners, each transport van closed with the same heavy metallic sound. One, then another, then the last. Steel doors slammed shut with enough force to echo across the vineyard. The sound rolled through the ruined estate like the final period at the end of a very long sentence. The Sinclair dynasty hadn't ended with shouting. It hadn't ended with helicopters. It hadn't even ended with handcuffs. It ended the moment those steel doors locked, carrying away the people who had mistaken power for permission and control for love. Captain Briggs placed one steady hand against the side of my gurney. "Let's get you home, Lieutenant." This time, home no longer meant the Sinclair estate. I felt the helicopter lift before I actually saw the ground disappear. The familiar vibration traveled through the evacuation litter beneath me as the engines reached full power. The rotors threw another cloud of Georgia dust across the battered vineyard, covering overturned tables, broken wine bottles, crushed flower arrangements, and the tire tracks left by federal transport vans. The Sinclair's estate slowly slipped away beneath us. A medic checked the straps holding my oxygen mask in place. "Comfortable?" "As comfortable as someone with 2 angry lungs can be," he chuckled. "I'll take that as progress. That's probably the nicest thing anyone said to me all weekend." A few people laughed. The sound surprised me, not because it was funny, because it reminded me how long it had been since I had heard laughter that didn't come at someone else's expense. Inside the aircraft, everything felt familiar. The clean scent of disinfectant, medical equipment secured against the cabin walls, portable monitors blinking beside me, the steady rhythm of trained professionals moving around without wasting words. This was my world, not marble floors, not wine tastings, not country club politics. This. Captain Roland Briggs finished reviewing the latest readings on the portable monitor before looking down at me. "Oxygen is climbing. Finally, 92. I'll take it. You don't really have another option." I smiled behind the mask. "Still working on bedside manners, Captain?" "I save those for patients who actually follow medical instructions." "Fair enough." He folded the tablet shut. "I told you not to leave military supervision. You did. And I made a terrible decision. You made a human decision." He pulled up one of the folding seats beside my litter. "You wanted your family." The cabin fell quiet for a moment. I wanted one normal night. I looked toward the small window beside me. I thought if I came home wearing the uniform instead of asking for anything, maybe things would finally be different. Were they? I watched the estate growing smaller beneath us. "No." Captain Briggs nodded once. "Sometimes accepting the truth hurts less than continuing to negotiate with a lie." Those words stayed with me. Outside, the vineyards looked almost peaceful from the air. The destroyed reception area became nothing more than scattered white dots. The helicopter's landing marks carved circles into the grass. Emergency vehicles lined the driveway like tiny toy trucks. The mansion itself looked much smaller than I remembered. Growing up, I believed that house represented power. Looking through the helicopter window, it barely looked larger than the maintenance barns surrounding it. Perspective changes altitude. One of the younger medics leaned over with another medication check. "Feeling dizzy?" Less. Nausea? A little. Chest pain? Mostly pressure. Good. I laughed softly. I've never heard anyone call that good. It means the treatment is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. He adjusted the IV line. You came very close. I know. No. He looked directly at me. I don't think you do. He pointed toward my wrist monitor. When your emergency signal reached Fort Stewart, your oxygen level had already dropped into territory we usually associate with respiratory failure. I stayed quiet, he continued. If you had waited much longer, he didn't finish. He didn't need to. I already understood. Captain Briggs rested one steady hand on my shoulder while checking the oxygen tubing. No dramatic speech, no exaggerated reassurance. Just the kind of quiet gesture soldiers make when words aren't necessary. Around us sat people who had left their own families, interrupted their own weekend plans, and launched 3 Black Hawks without hesitation because one officer needed help. None of them asked whether I came from a wealthy family. None of them cared about my inheritance. None of them questioned whether rescuing me was worth damaging expensive landscaping. They simply came. That realization hit harder than anything that had happened inside my parents' house. I had spent years trying to earn love from people who treated it like a business transaction. Meanwhile, the people wearing the same uniform as me never asked what I could give them first. One of the medics handed Captain Briggs a small, clear evidence bag. We found this in Lieutenant Sinclair's jacket. He looked inside before passing it to me. I believe it belongs to you. I stared at the object through the plastic. My father's Sinclair family signet ring. Heavy gold, dark engraved crest. He had forced it into my hand during my commissioning ceremony years earlier. You're a Sinclair before you're a soldier, he'd told me. At the time, I believed him. I slowly removed the ring from the evidence bag. It felt colder than I remembered. Heavier, too. Funny how guilt can add weight to metal. I rolled it between my fingers while looking back through the window one last time. The estate had become nothing more than a distant patch of land disappearing behind us. I thought about Grandpa. Not Arthur. Grandpa Silas. The man who taught me to repair fences, drive tractors, and shake every worker's hand before asking them to work another hour. He used to tell me something my father never understood. If someone has to fear you before they'll respect you, they never respected you at all. I finally understood what he meant. Near my litter sat a sealed biohazard disposal container. It waited for contaminated medical waste, used syringes, protective gloves, anything unsafe to carry forward. I looked at the ring one last time. Then, without ceremony, without anger, without another speech, I dropped it into the container. The gold disappeared beneath red disposal liners with a quiet metallic click. Nobody applauded. Nobody commented. Captain Briggs simply nodded once. He understood. I leaned back against the litter and watched blue sky replace everything below. For 31 years, I believed family was something you kept paying for, even when the price was your own voice, your own peace, or eventually your own life. I kept thinking that if I worked harder, stayed stronger, or asked for less, one day the people closest to me would finally see me instead of seeing what they could control. They never did. Lying on that estate while my lungs were failing taught me something no military school ever could. Respect cannot be forced, borrowed, or earned by sacrificing your dignity. The people who truly value you will never ask you to prove your worth while you're struggling to breathe. I also learned that boundaries are not acts of cruelty. Sometimes they are the only thing standing between survival and surrender. Walking away from people who repeatedly choose power over compassion is not weakness. It is often the healthiest decision you will ever make. The uniform I wear did not save me because of rank. It saved me because it represents duty, trust, and people who keep showing up when someone calls for help. Blood may introduce you to a family, but character decides who will stand beside you when everything falls apart. Before you leave, take a look at the story waiting for you on your screen. It's one of the videos people return to the most because it reveals another family secret that seemed impossible until the truth came out. If this story stayed with you, that one just might stay with you too.